Hi, wonderful people. I'm Leah. As a sociologist, University of Melbourne professor, founder of the Gender Equity Initiative, director of the Future of Work Lab, woman, wife, and mother. I've made it my life's mission to take down every ridiculous gender myth out there. Together, we'll deep dive into the research to get to the bottom of all these misperceptions that are holding all of us back. Don't worry, I've studied these types of questions for decades, and after publishing countless articles exactly on these topics, I know when they are nonsense or real truths. And I'm going to help you learn that too. So here we go. Let's do it. This is Misperceived. On today's podcast, I'm going to talk to you about dads. Are they getting more egalitarian? Are they parenting in different ways? Are they looking at fatherhood in new and unique ways? So on this one, we're going to unpack the misconception. Is this generation of dads doing more than the last? Or is this all smoke and mirrors? I'm going to talk to you first about a paper that I talked to you about a little bit in another podcast. It's a paper with Brendan Churchill at the University of Melbourne, Sabina Cornrich at NYU Abu Dhabi, and myself. And in that paper, we were really interested in looking at what's happening to dad's time in childcare. So we looked at three things. We looked at childcare, we looked at housework, and we looked at employment. And one of the things we were looking at is, are dads spending more time with their kids in the primary care of their children with each subsequent generation? And the answer was pretty resoundingly yes. So Gen X dads are spending more time in the primary care of their children than boomers, and millennials are spending more than in Gen X. So each generation is spending more time than the last. So I want you to think about this is something like 45 minutes amongst baby boomers, and then maybe an hour and 15 for Gen X and close to 2 for millennials. So we showed that with each generation, they're spending more time than the previous. So is the podcast done? Is that the answer? Have I just told you everything? I think one of the challenges is that we still think mother's care perhaps is primary, but we also think that dads play this really important role. And that's changing how marriages work. That's changing how fatherhood is work. That's changing the dynamics within each partnership amongst generations and then within families. And so what I want to help you do is unpack a little bit about what's going on in terms of how we understand fatherhood. So is it just that they're doing more than the last? Is it smoke and mirrors? Are women still the central kind of primary caregiver, or are we doing fatherhood differently? So on today's Misperceived, we're going to talk about, are we doing fatherhood differently, or is it just a little bit still of the past? So let's look a little bit about what's happening in your life when you think about perhaps your dad or, your grandfather, or looking up a generation or within your generation or across. What is it looking like? Is fatherhood looking different? Are you expecting your partner, if you're in a heterosexual union and you're a woman, do you expect when you marry and have a partnership and have kids that your husband will do something different? And if you're a heterosexual man or a man at this age and stage, are you thinking about fatherhood differently for you? Are you thinking about how you want to be different from perhaps your father or from your grandfather? And are you thinking about new ways in doing parenting? Well, let's talk a little bit about what happened in terms of parenting and the evolution over time. So in 1998, Sharon Hayes wrote this book called The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood. And she introduces this idea of intensive mothering. Now, she centers it on mothers, but I'm going to tell you that this really does apply to a lot of parents. Intensive parenting kind of became the norm. But let's break it down a little bit just for what it is. So intensive mothering is this idea that we have norms that good, and I'm putting that in quotes, good mothers are those who are nurturing at home, but competitive and tenacious at work. Good mothering is primarily the mother's responsibility. It is time intensive. It's child centered. It's expert guided. It's emotionally absorbing, and it's financially expensive. So do you want me to say those again, just so you can hear them one more time? Primarily the mother's responsibility. Time intensive. We give a lot of time to our kids. Child centered, e.g. the child is a focus rather than the parents being the focus. expert guided. We're looking to people like me. Thank you very much. But looking to experts about how do we raise our children. We're supposed to be engaged and absorbed within our children's lives, and children are expensive. We're supposed to spend a lot of money on everything that they're doing. They absorb a huge amount of cost. One of the things about this kind of idea of intensive mothering, or you can think about intensive parenting, is that it is a white upper class norm. So this is an ideal that's happening in white upper class families. And a lot of scholars have said that, actually, this is not really the diversity of families that are out there. This is not what good parenting looks like for families of color or different ethnic groups or different types of parents. But the problem is that even if we don't specifically ascribe to these norms, we live within institutions, legal systems, schools, workplaces that do. And so people are held accountable to these norms of intensive parenting that are white and upper class. So regardless of whether you think they're right, sometimes you can be punished if you don't ascribe. Now, when we think about this, we think about dads. So, okay, I'm saying this is about intensive mothering, but of course, dads play a critical role because this is really about parenting becoming time intensive, labor intensive, a huge amount of investment in the kids. And what we're asking is dads to be expected to be more present, to be more engaged with their children because these social norms have shifted, whereby the parent and child relationship is about spending more quality time together. Now, again, this is an upper white middle class model, but it is still a model. So Annette Lareau, in her book, Unequal Childhoods, shows that in upper middle class families, that there's this huge emphasis on making sure that your children have a lot of activities. There's this concerted cultivation. You're trying to prepare them for adult life, but adult life in professional areas. So the children have a lot of scheduling. They're in a lot of activities. They're asked to actually talk to authority figures, right? Like to be, when you go to the doctor, the children are asked to talk to the doctor. It's a practicing of how do you engage with adults, in part to prepare them for life in the future of you will be like the doctor. So talk to the doctor as a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old with authority. And a lot of the time is spent in parents' care or someone is monitoring their care. What is interesting is she talks about working class parenthood and norms are totally different. And this is about providing your kids with the basic necessities, but then giving them a lot of freedom. Freedom to engage in childhood. It's really child-centered, so child-centered play. And this idea that, childhood is this period of time before adulthood, which becomes hard, difficult, and overwhelming. And so they want to give children a lot of time together to be free to goof around with other children in the neighborhood, to go and play and to do all these kinds of things. So let me be crystal clear on what I'm saying. There is actually no one way to parent. And of course, there is mixing across, right? It's not that all upper class families do A, B, and C, and all working class families do D, E, and F. Of course, parents parent in different ways, and they bring different kind of ways of parenting that transcend each. And of course, there's no wrong or right way to parent, right? Different pieces of this bring incredible value to their children. But I think there's a question about what does this mean for dads? If we have this kind of changing expectation that's really the child at the center, how are dads fitting into this? Is it actually that dads are stepping in? Or is it just that all this additional work that we expect of parents, the intensive parenting norms, the idea that they need to be overscheduled, that we're preparing them for the future of work through their childhood, is that just falling to moms? So research from Sarah Tabo and David Padula, and Sarah is one of my great and wonderful friends, shows that actually young men today are wanting a more equal division in their families. So they did this research probably about 10 years ago, and they were asking young men at that time, who now probably actually have their own families, right? They are probably those who are entered into parenthood. And what they were saying was they really wanted equal divisions within their family, that given the option, they wanted to be equal carers and they wanted to be equal sharers. And so there is this shift across generations to be more present for children, to be more active in children's care, and this shift towards intensive parenting that brings time intensive stuff, but also this concerted cultivation that brings like this need to kind of invest in the children, is resulting in men spending more time in the primary care of their children. And that primary care is not just, sitting on the couch while your kid's there and you're watching TV and they're playing on the floor, but it's actually like engaged childcare. It's reading to them and playing with them and bathing them and taking care of them in this really kind of hands-on way. And there's a lot of research that shows that that's really good for kids, right? To have dads engaged. And we're showing that men are doing more of that work. So how do we understand this? Is it just intensive parenting, or how are men doing that? Because we talk a lot about mothers, but now I'm going to bring you into what's going on for dads. So within the scholarship, there's kind of this rise of this idea that there's different kind of ways to describe the ways in which men are caring. One of the ways in which they're doing this is called caring masculinities. And this is a reconfiguration of masculine identities away from the values of domination and aggression towards kind of attitudes that prioritize family support and care. So it's a shift away from these traditional forms of masculinity towards more caring and empathetic forms of masculinity. And these nurturing and caring identities are shown to allow men to engage more deeply in family life. And this leads to a range of positive behaviors for men and perceptions on gender. I'll tell you that there's research coming out of Sweden that shows, when you live in a country in which there's a lot of pressure to be really traditionally masculine, you have a lot of negative health outcomes for men. They're more likely to engage in risky behavior. They're more likely to drive riskily. They're more likely to die early. So there's a lot of actual consequences when we tell men that they need to be tough, they need to take risks, and they need to be violent. The result of that is a lot of times men die. There's mortality rates for men that go up when we have these traditional norms. And when we provide men with more encompassing ways of being men, that actually they end up with a lot of better health outcomes. They are healthier. They sleep better. Our research shows they sleep better. So these are important and shifting norms about how we are and are not men and women. And when we move a little bit away from the more traditional forms, we find that there's a range of benefits for men and families alike. So men who adopt these caring masculinities, they report that they're more emotionally, physically, and psychologically enriching in their lives. A study in the US shows that for stay-at-home fathers, when they shift their gender norms and masculinity, they take on more of the primary care of children. And the result of that is they end up with higher levels of satisfaction in caring for their children. They have greater emotional connections with others. And they have an increased respect for caregiving more generally. So giving men the opportunity to be that primary carer not only has this positive impact on them, but it shifts the way they view caring in general. And what they said for those who were really engaged as the primary carer was that it helped them become more nurturing and sensitive parents. There is something very unique about the experience of parenting and being the primary carer to a wonderful, young, complex, sometimes tantrum-ish child that builds in people, not just mothers, but fathers too, skills that you often can't get anywhere else. It is hands-on training in empathy, love, greater understanding, and sensitivity. So that's kind of this caring masculinity. In addition, there's this idea that there's this involved fathering. This is very similar to this caring masculinity, but it refers to men who are more engaged, accessible, and nurturing in their children's lives, but still are working full time. So they can have this full-time career, but they're really trying to do parenting different. And in that way, they're trying to be engaged, accessible, and nurturing to their children. This involved fathering emphasizes that when fathers are more involved in their children's lives, what they have is greater job satisfaction. They report greater work-family enrichment, and they have lower work and family conflicts. So having men step into caring roles at home, even if they maintain full-time work, brings a benefit to work, right? To their work lives. It's all wonderful. And so one of the things for these men that creates kind of internal conflict is that they know they want to be more present. They believe that childcare should be more equally divided, but it's difficult to do that when you're working full time, and it's difficult when both are working full time. So this creates an internal conflict for many of these men because they want to be engaged deeply in their children's lives, but they cannot access the time because they are expected to be at work full time. And this can create some sort of conflicting expectations of what it means to be a father. But the short answer is that kind of creates an internal struggle. But the result of that is that there's a range of benefits, even if you're working full time and present with your children. What this requires, however, is for us to unlearn traditional breadwinner expectations, that what we're socialized in, and this is where I talked to you at the top of this episode about intergenerational change, that what I want to stress is this stuff is really, really good for men, that engaging men in more care, having men more present in the family brings benefits to men themselves, and I've given them to you as well, but it also brings a range of benefits to their children and to their marriages. And we know that men want to be more present in care, and we know that men want equal divisions within their partnership. So we're seeing time is changing for men. They are investing more time. We're seeing that their attitudes are changing. There is a preference to be more present for children. And we're seeing that they are actually in doing this work and they're getting this range of benefits. So I am telling you that fathers are doing fatherhood more equally, but they want to be more involved in their children's lives, but there's something happening that's getting in the way. There's something that is happening that is not letting them reach parity. There's something that's happening that's not letting them actually achieve full equality. And so I want to walk you through these. What are the things that are keeping men from doing this? So you have a group of men that want to be present, that are giving more time, that are reaping the benefits of this, and yet you still have inequality in parenting between mothers and fathers. So what's kind of getting in the way? It's not desire, it's not attitudes. What is it? I know many of you are probably hitting mute because you have about 18 explanations you want to throw in. And let me tell you, send those through to us. We'd like to hear what you think. What do you think's getting in the way? You're living in these partnerships, many of you, right? You're looking at a husband or a father or a man who wants to be more engaged in caregiving and yet maybe is falling a little bit short in terms of equity, in terms of full parity within their partnerships. What do you see happening? What's getting in the way? What do you think are the barriers? Let me do a couple that I see, and then let's see if we're aligned. Number one is that there is no paid parental leave for US fathers. There's also no paid parental leave in other countries around the world, but the US, let me tell you, is very specific. It is one of the only Western industrialized nations in the world that doesn't provide paid parental leave for parents. Now, this is really critical because that transition into parenthood is this really important time in which gender norms traditionalize. And what you need is fathers present, not at work, not 50% there, but actually present in the primary care of their children. The reason is that if you have fathers who are there at the start, with their kids, primary caring, it brings a host of benefits. It leads to more equal divisions of childcare. It leads to more equal divisions of housework. And it leads to kids will come to the fathers when they're hurt. It leads to greater emotional bonding for the children at that period of time, but not just that period of time into the future. It ends up setting the course of the family up for greater equality. It allows fathers to be more engaged with their children. And that period of time after the birth is so critical to the future of the family. And so if you don't have fathers who can access paid leave during that period of time, and you don't have mothers who can access paid leave during that time, it's a problem. It is essential that fathers have some of that time with the kids one-on-one, but we can talk about that in another podcast. The second thing is that it's very difficult for men to reduce time to be with their children. It's very difficult for men to access resources at work, flexible work or reduced time or signaling that they're not serious about work by being co-present in the home for their kids because we still hold men to a breadwinner norm at work. And so it's very difficult for them to reduce some of their work time to be present for the kids. We have to reduce some of that barrier. The third thing is that men have less confidence in caregiving before they have a direct experience in it. Now, we have a paper on this. We're working on a paper on this, but just to foreshadow some of the results, we're finding that actually men's confidence in caring for kids is less until they become a father. They have that direct experience and then it's on parity. Then actually it disappears. So we need to figure out ways to give men more access to caregiving for younger kids in a ways that build their confidence. Now, the other thing I just want to talk about, it keeps coming through our research, is that many of the men are talking about, many of the fathers are saying, I want to do parenting differently. I want to be a different father than my father. I want to carry the good stuff through, but I want to drop some of the stuff and bring new stuff out. We also found, and this came through really clearly in our research, is that a lot of men say they lack a clear role model for the father they want to be. They don't exactly know how to do what they want to do because they haven't seen it. And so many of them are talking about kind of piecing together different men in their lives and taking elements of that and bringing it into their new ways of parenting. Now, sometimes this can look like a university professor that they once had who said something or did something different, or pieces of their own father or their grandfather, of course, but it also can be kind of cultural images. We heard people talk about Bluey's dads and looking at cartoons or things like this about how to be good dads. Now, the thing I want to point out is that Women had about 100 years to transition into their new role of worker. The fight for women's equality started a long, long time ago. And there's this argument that, women have been transitioning into this new role for a long time. And so the transition is kind of incremental. But for men, it happened in a generation. It is, happening quickly and rapidly. And so when the change is quick, it's hard to keep up, or it's hard to see exactly where I should be going, or it's hard to always get it right, or it's hard to not bring in things from childhoods that don't work anymore in terms of modern life and modern parenting. And because of that change happening rapidly, it means that men are still, and women too, of course, are still located in systems that haven't caught up, in systems that still think that there's one breadwinner and one homemaker, or a system that expects you to be completely devoted to your work and have no life outside that work. So there is this change that's happening rapidly, and the men in our interviews are talking about that a lot, that it's hard for them internally. It's an internal struggle to try to figure out how to do it right and how to do it in a way that supports the family. So, is it in fact a misperception that each generation of dads is doing more than the last? No, it's not. Actually, we show that men are doing more and fathers are more engaged. And what's more is that if we gave them the tools and the resources to actually engage with their families more, if we could give them paid parental leave following the birth of the child, if we could give them flexible work, if we could start thinking about how do you become a caregiver at work, or training our young boys to have experiences as caregivers in schools, that we would probably see the gender pay gaps reduce, or gender gaps in employment start to reduce, or time use start to close, because really, actually, these men want to. They have a desire to. They find being with their families valuable, but we don't yet have the resources and the tools to let them do that. So if we can give them that, I say watch out. What we'll see is happier families, we'll see happier marriages, and we'll see men fully engaged in care. So, as per usual, thank you so much for spending this time with me on Misperceived, where you don't need a PhD. You just get to come hang out with me. This podcast was produced with the support of the incredible Sophie Squires, the wonderful Kate Danger, the fantastic Rich Berner, and the one and only, the best ever made, Serena Reagan. I would like to acknowledge that our podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today.